Hello, my name is Fincher. I will be the host this evening. Joining me in this interview is Robert McQueen, and we will be speaking with Jacob Montgomery, who is an expert on drones and privacy interests for the Fourth Amendment. Mr. Montgomery wrote an article titled Protecting Reasonable Expectations of Privacy in the Age of Drones, a framework for balancing privacy interests with the utility of drones in law enforcement. Now, Mr. Montgomery, recently in New York, um, the police have been using drones to survey and watch large barbecues and parties in the backyard, and this has created quite a bit of uproar in the state. And this kind of counterbalances with another narrative that's coming out in across the country in California, where drones were used to help catch kidnappers and rescue hostages. Um, so this whole drone situation and privacy, it seems a little more complicated than face value. What do you think of this?
Well, I think it's really important. Not only have they helped that, but they can be used for so many more applications. I mean, police have been using them in daily patrols in some places um, to help in hostile situations, not just hostage, but to get a better view of the surroundings. But more particularly, like you explained, kind of in this New York situation, they can also be used to investigate and to monitor specific individuals and kind of their activities. And it kind of goes against the whole protections that the Fourth Amendment creates, especially when we think of the curtilage and the home. The home is considered, even under, especially under the Constitution, kind of this sacred place, and we've extended that protection in a degree to the curtilage. Um, which, for those who don't know, the curtilage is kind of that area immediately surrounding the home, usually identified by a fence. Often we consider like our backyard, um, where we consider that we still have those privacy protections, but yet we can the police have these drones monitoring that area? I mean, that's really what the question comes down to, because the court has not addressed the issue particularly, and legislatures have been slow to kind of create these frameworks and these ideas on how to address drone issues, but it's really been left into the hands of the legislatures. But to understand that, it's important to really talk about kind of what the court looks at with the Fourth Amendment and how they've responded to these kind of threats before.
Well,
Now,
before we go there, Jake, just one of the letters from our viewers here I was asking, why is it that we do need a new framework when we already have regulations that cover police walking around with body cameras? What makes a drone categorically distinct from an officer who just happens to have a camera who's looking into the curtilage, as you said?
Yeah, well, I think it goes to a lot to what we expect, like as a homeowner, um, where people can look and where an officer can be and look. If you don't want people looking into your yard, you can create a fence.
well,
It's a
but
rather, go
Well,
ahead.
Mr. Montgomery, the Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things being seized. So, I mean, body cams are people on the streets, but drones flying over someone's backyard, that seems to me to be within this housing area that the first sentence of the Fourth Amendment covers.
Yeah, you would think so, but the way that the courts have kind of addressed this issue is that they're not in a degree, because you have exposed that area to that view. The police has a right to be there and in that area, and they can see what may be seen from where they have a right to be, is the famous quote that you often hear.
Is the
Um,
is the area they're allowed to be in the air above the house? Like, and how, if so, how far and how high?
well, and it's a great question because we simply don't know. There is no bright line standard, but we do have some cases that give us an idea of, where might the court set this limit. Um, we've all heard of the famous case of Florida v. Riley, but for those who don't know, the police were operating a helicopter within 400 feet of a home, and they used it to see a man growing marijuana in his backyard in a greenhouse that was uncovered although it was not visible from the street or anywhere else where a normal patrolling police officer, where a body cam, as Mr. McQueen points out, could easily see, police were allowed to use that helicopter to look in because people don't have an expectation of privacy. And that's where it all comes down to is in cats, the court comes up with this test, well, through the concurrence, that whether a search has occurred, which brings up the Fourth Amendment and those protections. That has to be the first question needs to be answered is, has there been a search?
Well, speaking of a search has been actually occurred or not, in that case, why was a search not occurred? Is it because the marijuana field was in an open area, or was it because they were able to see it from the air, or was it because there was some other reason there shouldn't have been an expectation of privacy?
It's kind of a combination. So under cats, you have the reasonable expectations of privacy. It's a two-part test. And then you have whether people are prepared to recognize that expectation of privacy is reasonable. So in cats, in Riley, it largely fell on that second prong because we've become accustomed to helicopters in our day-to-day lives and kind of them being in the airspace. They're heavily regulated. We know about them. We can see them. So when you asked,
quick question with that. Helicopters, they're very big. You can have binoculars on them and maybe cameras, but they're very loud and you can see them and kind of understand them. Drones are much smaller and there's growing technology. You have like thermal imagery, close-up images, the ability to get really close to a home and people not notice. So how is that like? At what point does that become a search with that new advancing technology?
Yeah, and that's kind of the heart of the issue is right now how it's largely been responded to and theorized is that drones should be treated just like manned aircraft. But the problem is that manned aircraft have their own limitations. As you pointed out, they're loud, they're obvious, and even as Mr. McQueen pointed out with law enforcement on the ground. Can't they continuously surveil an area? Can't they follow people without implicating a search? But they're more obvious and there's natural limitations. A police officer on the ground gets tired. You have to switch out shifts. It's a little harder to hide a police car or, someone seeing the same person every day. Whereas a drone, although now the technology isn't quite there now, so far as the silence, we're heading towards that. Some military applications have completely silent small drones that can operate for an hour.
What's the difference then between a tall police officer versus a drone at the practical street level? Isn't defense only as effective as the next tallest person? What makes a drone different from just having tall police officers with cameras?
Well, sure, but you can defend against tall police officers by building a fence, raising your blinds. And even then, you kind of create, if a suspect notices that they're being monitored, they create their own barriers to cease that monitoring.
Like as a practical matter, most cities won't let you have fences that are over a certain height. It's pretty easy to find somebody who's going to be taller than your average fence. Not in all cases, but for a substantial part of the population, there wouldn't really be a material difference. So do we think that because it's electronic and because it's indefatigable, like you're saying, that there's a difference between that and an average police officer? Or do we think it's really part of the same unresolved issue?
Well, there's absolutely a difference. Go back to Riley. Again, you couldn't see that greenhouse or the contents inside without looking from an above view. From within 400 feet. And now that was with the use of a helicopter. Now you have some, what's to say the limit of a drone at 20 feet?
Well, how much airspace are we entitled to in at what point does our home include airspace or does it include airspace?
When are we too far off the ground for it to not be a police officer anymore walking around just a tall person, but still low enough that we're not having our privacy violated? Like by a helicopter, like what is there some sort of like magic range where it's like, oh, if it's over 8 feet but less than 20, it's protected, or how would we address that?
Yeah, so there is no magic range. We know that in Riley, they said 400 feet with a helicopter is constitutional. Now, we also have a case which, if you're following kind of this Olmsted Jones trespass oriented line of whether a search occurred, I think United States versus Cosby is kind of our main focus. And in that case, it was, where does a landowner have a property interest? At what point does a trespass occur? In that case, many of law students would have heard of it before, especially in their property classes, where the landowners live near an airport where airplanes were frequently passing above their house at a height of 83 feet. And the loud noise of the aircraft were causing the chickens of the landowners to kill themselves and to die. So many law students would have heard that case, and it's quite memorable given the strange and unique facts. But it's super important when we look at this issue, especially looking at the court's rationale. So they didn't set a strict line. The planes were traveling at 83 feet above, and they said that a trespass had occurred, but they also focused on how much of a kind of an interruption to the landowner's use of the property did those airplanes create. And we know from that case that a landowner has at least as much of a property interest of the space above the ground as they can occupy or use.
So dead chickens aside, what we can say is that we do have a precedent for relying on a practical test of whether or not your enjoyment of the land has been impeded. And do you think that that might be a usable framework going forward?
We do have a test, and I think if, as you see these cases evolve, I think you'll see it start to take shape out of Cosby and to find a middle ground. But right now, it's not really applicable to drones because they don't create an annoyance and they don't create that much of an interruption.
Well, something to circle back to is we have this concept of trespass and the ability. We know that thermal imaging exists, like that's out there. And if you take a drone with thermal imaging, you can probably see within someone's home. Now, under what you mentioned earlier, this plain view doctrine and the police having the right to, be in that airspace and look down. At what point does like this thermal imaging and being able to look into someone's house in that way constitute a trespass?
Yeah, so I think there you would look to Kylo, which is kind of our leading case on advanced technology. And in that case, the court comes up with a rule, which similar facts to if we look at Riley, where someone's growing marijuana, except instead of using a helicopter, they use, thermal imaging, as you said, to detect the presence of marijuana in hot heat lamps. And there the court said that, it's an invasion of the reasonable expectation of privacy to be able to, see within the walls using a technology that isn't in common use. And that such technologies, it's kind of a per se ban on those technologies.
But if drones become more common use and they're becoming pretty frequent, I believe in your paper you noted that there's like over 700,000 FAA registrations of drones.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're becoming common technology, is that going to affect our right to privacy from drones?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're already there. I mean, you hear about the neighbor having a drone and everyone knows about them. I think military applications really brought them to the forefront, but now that they're in private use and residential use, I mean, you can buy one, go to your local Target or Walmart right now and buy one. And not bad ones either. So if that's what you can buy from Walmart, imagine what the police can get their hands on.
And so under the Kylo precedent, then if it's in common use, will police be able to use drones with thermal imagery? Because thermal imagery is also becoming a little bit more in common use. Is it like, oh, well, you'll have to put in like iron or lead sheets to protect yourself from invasion?
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think when the court created Kylo, they weren't quite realizing that these things might be one day in common use. But I think stable minds will prevail. I mean, the thermal imaging still today, although like you said, it's growing in use, I think the ruling in Kylo wouldn't change today. I think it's a matter of being able to see and view within an area where someone has taken those protections, and where the home obviously is different. The
Well,
court's
Jake, I really like your impulse there to bring up torts, because at the end of the day, what made it a trespass was it was a material interference in their ability to enjoy the property. And if you are in your home and you're being thermal imaged, I think the average person would agree that that is a material hindrance to their ability to enjoy their own property. Do you think that torts might be, or the tort framework for trespass might actually be the way forward on this?
No, because our Fourth Amendment, and you're not trespassing most of the time, as Katz recognized, because that's what the court would have said under Olmsted or Jones, was that, trespass is the way, which didn't recognize these evolving technologies, which Katz really came to the forefront and changed that and made it so that it's not just trespass. We now have these reasonable expectations of privacy, and you need a warrant if you're going to monitor someone from far away within their home. So although I do think trespass is an important part of this, as we talked about with Cosby and Riley, and kind of when does that trespass occur, that's an important prong to the issue. But it's also important to note what practices are in place now.
Yeah.
The FAA has largely been the one who has come out and regulated drones. The FAA is more responsible for advancing privacy interests than anyone right now, but they're not operating for privacy. They're operating for operational safety, requiring certain licenses, and they mandate certain airspaces where drones can be in. So right now, so far as trespass goes, the FAA has done a lot towards that, but still, there's this problem that drones can operate within a pretty low airspace above your home, lower than a helicopter. And it just leaves a lot of questions for when does the search occur? What do I have to do to my property to make sure I'm not being surveilled without a warrant?
Well, speaking of practical solutions, then would you say that if the FAA has been the number one advocate for privacy just by regulating the safe use of these devices, do you think that the states have a big role to play and as an experiment to see how to effectively do this? Or do you think this is more the purview of the federal government because it's a constitutional issue?
Well, I think the federal government has kind of made their claim for what they're focusing on, and that's the safe introduction of drones into the airspace. And I do think the states are the ones who need to respond to this. They're the ones who can kind of analyze and change more rapidly. And the Supreme Court, I think, is going to continue to rely on our Katz-based approach and on Riley and on our helicopter doctrines to address this issue. I don't know that a new rule would come out of a drone-based search, because some of the facts are similar, which doesn't recognize the vast difference in drones to manned aircraft. But I do believe it's the states who need to place limitations on these, and they have. Already we're seeing a lot of states pass legislation, but the problem is the states are outright banning them, locking them behind warrant-based requirements. If police want to use a drone for anything that's not an exception, they have to get a warrant. And those exceptions usually are for search and rescue or fires, natural disasters. But if you have a case where, law enforcement, they could use a helicopter to go and view whether there's a marijuana grow in this backyard within the constitutional bounds. They could not do the same thing from the same area with a drone, which just costs the taxpayers money and, doesn't make sense with our precedent. But they're still that issue of like, well, if they are using a drone, at what height should it just, if it only they use them like helicopters? I mean, there needs to be some kind of limit to find common ground.
Yes,
well, that may speak more to the role of police in our civilization in general. But sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So last question for you, Mr. Montgomery. You mentioned the states issue or states issuing these warrants. Now, there is the federalism, separation, federal power and state power. There's also different policing. You have federal police agencies and you have state police agencies. So are you aware of the requirements for federal agencies versus state agencies, and if there are any, if there's any protections from it, and if not, what would you suggest?
Yeah, well, federal agents are still operating under the limitations of the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, and the Fourth Amendment. um, so really, for most states, and most states too, only several states have kind of created these warrant-based requirements. So they're still operating under the same constitutional Riley and Katz kind of formula. So really, a drone can operate most anywhere, so long as it's not trespassing, which is kind of a case by case basis to determine. So it's also really difficult for law enforcement to know how can they use these and when can they use them and when do they need a warrant, because it's a question of, if they had a helicopter they could use that, but it costs extreme expense and wasted time to do that. Whereas drones can be a tool used by smaller police forces and people who don't have access to them, to complete the same goals as a helicopter would, with less expense to the American taxpayer.
Thank you, sir. Well, this has been What's the Buzz with Ben Fincher and Robert McQueen. We would like to say thank you to our special guest, Jacob Montgomery. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Have a great day.